So our third country that we're learning about, our third area of North America that we're learning about another very, very big country. And so it is about 3 times the size of Texas because North America really is made up just of these three really large countries. Number 2 country in the world in size in Canada, and then the number 3 country in the world in size in the United States, and now another really, really big country compared to the other countries of the world. So let's look at Mexico. We have to look at 7 different regions that we're going to have to be able to label on a map. And so you have your map in front of you, and we're going to look at these 7 regions. The first one that we'll talk about, I'm going to put numbers next to them here, is Baja California. And Baja California is this peninsula out on the west coast, okay, and it is right there, kind of that little jutting area that's sticking out down there. And so that is where we'll start. Now, number 2 is the Mexican Plateau. Mexican Plateau is this area in the middle. It is right between the 2 sets of mountains, which we're going to put in there later on. Okay, and so the mountain chains that are surrounding number 2, the Mexican Plateau, are the Sierra Madre Mountains, and that literally just means the mother. Okay, so Sierra Madre means mother mountains. And so the Sierra Madre is actually split into 2 different chains that kind of meet at the bottom and complete another chain. And so we're only going to need to know 2 of them. But the first one we need to know is the Sierra Madre Occidental. And the Sierra Madre Occidental means west. And so it is the western one. So on the left side, you can see these mountains that I'm drawing in now. Those are the Sierra Madre Occidental. So we'll put our 3 right there. And then the Sierra Madre Oriental would be, Oriental is east, and so those are on the east side. They're on the other side of the Mexican Plateau. And so that would be number 4. And so now we have our 2 sets of mountains, and they do meet up in the bottom and make this other mountain chain down here, which is called the Sierra Madre del Sur, but that will not be on any of your tests or quizzes about the maps. Okay, so just kind of for your information thing. And so 3 more to make up our 7 items that are going to be found on this map. And one of them is the Pacific Lowlands. And the Pacific Lowlands are obviously going to be out here by the Pacific Ocean, which is over here. Okay, and so the Pacific Lowlands is this green area right on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. And so to the west of the Sierra Madre Oriental, and right by the ocean there. So it runs up and down that coast, and then the next plain that is also in there, the next lowland that is in there for number 6 is the Gulf Coastal Plain. And the Gulf Coastal Plain is the same thing, that thin green area, but it's on the other side over by the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so that is number 6. And then number 7, the last one, is the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Yucatan Peninsula is this little jutting area out here. And we'll talk about each of these regions, what their climate is like, what kind of resources they have, and all of that kind of stuff in the next few slides. So we're going to start off with that long, skinny peninsula that's on the west side, the west coast, and that is called the Baja California. And Baja California is, there's a picture of it right up here. It is the way that that our old textbook actually said or explained it was that it was like Mars with cactus. And that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, because there's some cactus and some green land there, but it's basically this big red dirt desert. So it's very dry, and the land is not particularly useful for much of anything. And so not very many people live there. It's kind of like a red sand desert. Okay, and then the Mexican Plateau, however, is where most of the people live. Almost everybody lives there. It's right in the middle of the nation. It's between those 2 mountain chains, and it's high up in the air, and so the temperature is not too bad. It doesn't get too warm, doesn't stay too warm. And really, most of the main cities are here. The capital city and largest city in Mexico, named Mexico City, is found in that Mexican plateau, that central plateau. Okay, and the other thing about it that's kind of strange about the Mexican plateau is that the soil is kind of soft and it kind of has a tendency to settle down underneath especially heavy things. And so what's happening is there are these huge buildings built on this soft soil, and the earthquakes will start to shake them, and that will create a situation where the building starts to sink into the ground and settle into the grounds. The buildings are actually kind of sinking in some locations in Mexico City. And again, the mountain ranges flank on both sides. They flank that central plateau region. Okay, and they are the Sierra Madre Occidental, Oriental, and Del Sur. And again, Occidental means west, and so that's the one on the west side of the country. And then Oriental means east, that's one on the east side of the country. The Occidental look a little bit more like our Rockies, as you can see up here. And the Oriental look even a little bit younger, so they look a little bit sharper. And they're this picture right here. And because they're younger, they have an awful lot of minerals and metals and things like that that can be dug out of them and are very valuable to people. And so they're a good place for mining and things like that. Now, where they meet down in the south, in the Sierra Madre del Sur, that is also where two tectonic plates meet. And so because of that activity, there's a whole lot of earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that in that region that, kind of keep people away from that area. The other area that we're going to talk about on this slide is the Pacific Lowlands. The Pacific Lowlands is that narrow thing that runs right down the west side, right on the Pacific coast. And really, it's a very, very nice lowland, a nice plain, and it's home to many, many beautiful resort cities where a lot of tourists go to stay. Places like Acapulco, as well as other cities, but Acapulco is probably the one you maybe have heard of before. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is the Gulf Coastal Plain. And the Gulf Coastal Plain kind of runs all the way through this area. It is all part of it. Okay, and it is on the East Coast. So on the East Coast, it's on the western side. I'm sorry, that western coast is incorrect. Okay, it is on the western side of the Gulf of Mexico, but it's on the eastern coast of Mexico, and it includes the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, and the Yucatan Peninsula is kind of an interesting area. That's where Cancun is. You probably have heard of Cancun. But it is, the land is covered by the shell of the bedrock. Instead of the bedrock, there's a lot of limestone there. And so limestone has areas within it where water gets in there and weathers it away and erodes it, and it creates these huge underground caves. And if it gets bad enough and the cave gets large enough and close enough to the ground, then the ceiling of that cave can sink and create a sinkhole. And so there are these huge sinkholes with open caverns to the top of the, to the land, to the ground. And you can see all the way down into these caves, and the rain fills them up with water, and then they are known as cenotes. And so cenotes is just another word for these sinkholes that are created because the lime in the limestone is weathered away by the water. So cenote is just Spanish for these large sinkholes. So speaking about climate, there is a large part, or many, many different climates in Mexico because it's such a large country, but in the northern part and in Baja California, it is an arid climate, so very, very dry, mostly warm almost all of the year, but also definitely very dry, so kind of like a desert style climate. Okay, and so Baja California, that red desert, is obviously arid, as well as the big deserts that cover almost all of the northern part of Mexico, and those two are called the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahua Desert. And like I said, they cover almost all of northern Mexico. And then a big part of Mexico is also under the Tropic of Cancer, so that means it is in the tropics. So within the tropics, you have warm air that blows over the land. This warm, wet air from the ocean blows over the land, and then it cools down on top of the land and drops a lot of that rain. So you have a lot of warm and wet weather. And so that creates a situation where in the Yucatan and in the southern part of Mexico, there are a lot of tropical rainforests that grow in that area. In the Central Plateau, it's within the tropics too, but it's kind of controlled because it's so far up in the air that the temperatures are controlled by the altitude, because as you go up higher, it gets colder. And so the humid, or the actual designation is that it is a humid subtropical climate. And so humid subtropical climate is just right. It's not too wet, not too dry, not too cold, not too hot for growing crops. And so it is the easiest place to live in all of Mexico. So it's also where most people do live. And like I said, that altitude, how high up you are, affects temperature. As you go higher up in the air, it's colder, and as you go lower, it gets warmer. And so some of these mountains, the Cordilleras, the Sierra Madre mountains, are have snow caps on the top, even though it is a tropical climate. So if we look at this population density map, we can kind of figure out where most people live in Mexico, and I can kind of tell you the reasons why people do and don't live where they do. But in the northern part of Mexico, you can see it's pretty light colored, which means not very many people live there, and that's because it is so dry, it's arid. Okay, so it's dry and it's hot, and so it's tough to grow food, and not very many people are going to live there. Whereas in the central plateau part of Mexico, there are a lot of people. It's a much darker color because it's cooler and there's more rain than those dry desert areas. In the tropical regions way down low and out on the Yucatan Peninsula, you can also see it's pretty light. There's not very many people living there, and the reason people don't live there is because of those thick rainforests. The thick rainforest means that it's just hard to move from place to place. It's hard to make roads. It's just hard to get around and travel. And also, because there's so much rain, if you cut down the forest to build farms, it'll grow really good for a little bit, but all the rain will wash all the nutrients out of the soil, and within a couple of years the soil will be basically useless. Okay, and so really the moral of the story here that we're going to see every single time is that people just like to live where it's easier to live. And so you can see that really dark spot in the middle is right where the climate is nice, not too cold, not too warm, and where the crops grow the easiest. So if we look at some of the resources in Mexico, it's easy to see that they really do have a good amount of resources, some very good resources. And one of the big things is the metals that they create. Mexico creates the most silver of any place in the entire world. So silver is kind of their claim to fame, their biggest metal. They make the most of that over any other place in the entire world. And some of their other major metal products are copper and iron, but they also have good deposits of zinc, lead, and gold. So many mountains are found in metals are found in those Sierra Madre mountains. The other thing that is found readily in Mexico is oil. They have these huge untapped reserves, and right now they're drilling from these areas, sometimes in the water, sometimes on land, right by the Gulf Coast, right by the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a lot of oil out there. And oil's, because it's worth so much, is also probably their most important resource. But they also, just in all around the country, there are these huge untapped reserves, but they're kind of hard to get to, and so they need to develop them in order to get to the areas so that they can kind of get the money out of this oil before it gets taken by somebody else. The other thing that is a big resource in Mexico is their waterways. They're about 1/6 of all their power comes from hydroelectricity, and so they set up these dams and the turbines and all the kind of things we've talked about before. They set them up on these fast-running rivers that are on the edge of the Central Plateau. So the manufacturing centers of Mexico used to be mostly in Mexico City because that's where most of the people are, most of the workers are. But the government didn't want so much crowding in that area because that area is getting very, very crowded. And so they have given tax breaks and people relocations and all kinds of different stuff and tried to help out the companies to build more factories in the northern part right by the United States, which is also good for them because they sell a lot of their products to the United States, so it's easier to move around. There also is farming in Mexico, but really only about 1/5 or 20% of all the land in Mexico is usable for farming, and a lot of that land isn't even being used for farming. But in the land that they do farm, they grow corn, wheat, beans, sugarcane, fruits, and veggies. Okay, so they do grow a wide variety of crops. The other industry that's doing quite well in Mexico is fishing, and they do really good with their fishing industry, especially off the waters of Baja California. So out in the Pacific Ocean, right off there, there's a lot of fish that they catch for meat. In Mexico, the population is growing very, very fast. Since the 1900s, there are about 6 times as many people as there were in the early 1900s. And the reason this is happening is because the health system is improving. So as the health system is improving, people are living longer, and so the same amount of people are being born, but people are just around for longer, and so the population is getting larger and larger and larger. The population of Mexico is growing quite a bit faster than the population of the United States, and so you see a lot of immigrants coming in from Mexico because they're feeling overcrowded in their country with the growing population. Also in Mexico, about 3/4, about 75% of the people live in cities, and about 20% of the entire country lives in this one city, Mexico City. And so Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the entire world, and it's by far the largest city in North America. So it's bigger than New York City, bigger than Los Angeles, bigger than any of our large cities here in the United States. The other cities that are growing in Mexico are the border cities, the ones way up north, because those factories are being encouraged to be up there. But the problem with those border cities, a lot of times they're run by organized crime, and they're run by the people that are moving drugs across, and it turns into an area where there's lots of gangs and violence, and families really can't live there. And the other thing is they're put together really, really quick and really, really cheap just to get people a place to live, and the houses are really not very nice, and there's things like the entire town might not have running water or sewer or something like that. So they're not particularly good places to live, even though they are growing cities in Mexico. So there are a number of environmental problems in Mexico. One of them is pollution, and with so many people in such a small area, there is big problems in Mexico City with smog and pollution. You can see the picture right here. It shows, how nasty that cloud of pollution is that's stuck right above the city. And so when we think about pollution, we think about the amount of people working there, like 19.4 million people working in Mexico City, and about 4 million cars being driven every single day in that city. And so it's turning into this nasty pollution. And so the estimate is that pollution is causing people to get sick at a higher rate, and they have to deal with about 20 million called in sick days per year just due to the population, according to their calculations. So that pollution is actually causing a problem in the workforce and causing a problem with people's health. There also is issue with irrigation because it's a hot and sometimes dry country. They have to use a lot of sprinkler systems and irrigators and different things to water their crops. And so every time you water your crops, it leaves a small amount of salt on the top. It leaves behind this salt. And so as you're using irrigation instead of using natural rain, that salt starts to build up in the soil. And over time, if enough salt builds up in the soil, then it will ruin the soil. Because if you put salt in, with your dirt, nothing will grow in it. And so it's a way of essentially turning your good land, your farmland, into a desert as you're adding salt into it slowly. Deforestation is another problem because in the rainforest, the poor farmers are cutting down or burning down the trees to make this farmland. But like I said before, those heavy rains that happen in the tropics don't allow that soil to be good for very long. As it's raining and raining and raining and raining, it's washing out all the nutrients, all the good stuff that's making things grow from the soil. And eventually that soil becomes kind of worthless soil, and you know, it's only good for about 2 years. If you burn down an entire area of rainforest and you grow your crops there, it's only good for about 2 years before it becomes kind of weak soil to grow anything. And the other problem is, because then the poor farmers have to move on to the next area, the forests are disappearing, and they're disappearing at a very fast rate. And those are things that we need on our planet.